what we're planning to do is just to have a discussion this afternoon to finish off the day about a number of issues which go outside of the scope really of what's being discussed already, and to give the opportunity as well to you to come back with questions. Now, I'm hoping to keep everyone in terms of the length of their comments a little under control, so if I sound like a dictator at times, I hope that you'll forgive me. But the object really is to cover a number of different topics, get feedback and stimulate a discussion. So the point at which we thought we'd start is by looking at the significant level of public engagement that we see now on animal welfare matters. Thousands of people have attended protest across the country in relation to the live export trade, which became a very, very big issue within a very short period of time, but also in relation to other welfare matters like puppy farming. And countless others have been taking the time to communicate their concerns to parliamentary and governmental representatives. And we've seen at the same time an increase in direct action strategies on behalf of animal protection advocates, most notably in the form of compliance monitoring activities. So the question that I want to start by posing to the panel is whether this increased public engagement should be seen as a reflection of a healthy democratic process playing out in relation to matters of significant public concern, of increasing public concern, or whether it's a reflection of eroding public confidence in the government's handling of animal welfare matters more broadly. And probably out of fairness, Philip, I should ask you first to comment.
Okay. Thanks very much, Melissa. Clearly it's not a failure of government policy. How can that possibly be? But look, I think on the other side, to me, it is a reflection of healthy democratic processes. The thing that if we take the live animal export issue or the footage in the Indonesian abattoir as an example, I'm told by the government, by the people in my minister's office, that it's the single largest spike in media that they'd seen since 9/11. And I'm also overhearing a discussion last week between ministers' offices of... Okay. It's, as I said in my talk, I think it is clearly an issue where there's huge public awareness, and I've been reflecting a lot on why that's the case. And I think one of the reasons isn't so much the mismanagement, though that's clearly an issue. People have really strong concerns the government and industry should be doing more. But I also think that a lot of people are so far removed from the process of farming, and the distance between the food you consume and the farm for most of us is pretty large. So I can still remember when my daughter, number 2, discovered that the lamb on the styrofoam plate was exactly the same as little Bo Peep, and she was briefly vegetarian for about a day. But there is that image. I think if a lot of people were to witness the best possible slaughter conditions that exist in the country and then be surveyed on that, it'd be really interesting to see what impact that might have. So I think there are some things going on, but look, I think there's a longer term trend in that, and I think that having those sort of protests, all that sort of stuff, is part of the democratic process. And my experience in public policy in other areas is that out of every crisis there usually comes some good thing. There is a silver lining in the cloud.
Can I just ask you, Philip, just picking up on the point that you were making as to the significance of the response, do you see this as something that's likely to have a flow-on effect domestically with respect to the kinds of practices that people engage in abattoirs here in Australia? And do you think that there will be a public curiosity or interest in finding out more about those? Or do you think that the perception is that's a problem overseas and it's not a problem here?
I think it already has flowed on to a higher level of awareness in the Australian community about livestock practices in the community. In the farming sector, I'm pretty sure that most people don't understand a lot about it, but they do know one thing, and they can agree on one thing: they don't want to see any abuse of any form of any animal. And so I think it is really to my mind at least, it's the tip of the iceberg. I think it's one of those issues where maybe 5 to 10 years ago it was the preserve of interested lobby groups, passionate people, etc., etc. I think it's become entirely mainstream, and I can't see anything other than it not going away. I'm asked a lot about what's the future of Australian farming, and I think Australian farmers are tremendously resourceful, productive, etc., has been demonstrated in a bunch of different fields, but the issues that are going to hold the Australian farming sector back are the really hard ones. They're the sustainability issues, whether it's environment or animal welfare. They're really the things that I think in the next 5 to 10, 15 years are going to limit the growth in Australian industry, and they're really things that we try to work on with our industry colleagues to try and make sure that they are thinking through those issues, which I'm sure they do, but they're also confronted by a whole lot of immediate issues, not the least of which is high exchange rates, subsidised competition from overseas, input prices going up. So there's a lot to deal with if you're a farmer in the short run, but there's a lot of long run issues coming back and coming at them as well, and I think animal welfare will only increase in its significance.
Thank you. Celeste, I was going to ask if you might comment on sort of the legal framework within which these export issues arise, if that's an area that you feel comfortable to comment on.
Following on from...
On the dealing with the question of export and setting of export standards, and whether you see this kind of concern translating itself into a tightening of requirements more generally in relation to export of live animals.
Try to make the connection across, sorry. I think we already have seen a big shift with the SCAS that I was attempting to briefly explain in my presentation. One point, I had to skip right over my comments slide, but as with all things, it will depend at the end of the day at how effective the auditing and review and investigation processes are that follow on from that. But it certainly is on paper, a far better world than we had beforehand, because there was effectively nothing controlling or attempting to control what would happen to the animals once they reached their destination. So having something in place that at least is trying to, though as indirect as it is, and it's very early days to see if it's going to be effective, at least it has made a big leap in trying to raise standards that across the world, as we've seen, are quite so variable. And I think the extension out to the other animals that are exported, particularly sheep, and across the various markets, is a very positive thing to see, because we can't directly change the laws in other countries. The government can work within the OIE to keep the issues on the agenda to hopefully improve those standards that are within the Terrestrial Animal Health Code, though they are, fairly low standards, because the group, as has been mentioned, the membership of that group is very diverse. It includes a lot of developing countries, and they're just not going to agree to our standards yet. But having this kind of a supply chain in place across these markets will necessarily lead to people being trained. And hopefully that's going to flow on to the non-Australian animals, which we tend to, that totally focuses on the, quote, Australian animals. And even in the bigger abattoirs, they have some lines that are within an unapproved supply chain and some that aren't. So just because that's in place doesn't mean the non-Australian animals aren't subject to the same treatment we've seen. But at least it's movement in the direction that we would all hope to see.
Well, thank you. And Kathleen, can I ask you to comment on the impact that this debate has had on your industry that you've seen?
So you're referring to the live export debate?
I am, the live export issue.
Right. Well, I found the live export debate very interesting. I certainly would support Phil in, I think it's good that people are able in our society to express, a difference of opinion, or that they want to see change. I do question sometimes, though, if they are really well informed around the issue. They are well informed about what they've seen in terms of the suffering, because it is terrible suffering. I think we come back to the question of suffering again. But on other issues, so My industry actually doesn't export animals, well, live animals. So we're very fortunate. We do export a very few, it's very rare, some breeder animals, say, into Asia to support their breeding programs. So we tended to see what was happening in the live export issue as an opportunity for us. I liked what Phil said, in every crisis there are some great opportunities and you need to seek them out. And for us it was around, the importance of quality assurance even in abattoirs, about the verification and compliance in Australian abattoirs. So that's how it affected us. We looked at where could we provide leverage for what we're trying to achieve in terms of improving the animal welfare of pigs.
A moment ago,
Because we've referred to animals repeatedly, but we haven't even talked about what animals we mean by animals. And we've tended to assume that they're animals that are currently within the control of human animals. And there's a lot of animals that are not mammals or birds, and there's a lot of birds and mammals that are not owned and controlled by humans at the moment. And so it becomes really complex in trying to come up with a particular model that's going to suit all of these different sort of roles or places in the world more generally. So I think sometimes it from a legal point of view, we always come back to definitions, and words do matter an awful lot. So what we even mean by animal to begin with is sort of critical, and then, but perhaps guardian type models, or I think someone mentioned the idea of trusteeship. Some of the concepts coming out of those areas might be transferable into situations where an animal is within the control and really at the mercy of the owner. And the duty of care is one way that perhaps those types of ideas may get moved in, but as you say, having it come through a criminal statute's probably not ideal either. But no. I think there's a lot of room for ideas for people to come up with some different ways to try to tackle this, way to come up with a better concept. And if we could come up with a word that doesn't have any particular connotations already, that would be terrific, to move away from this persons versus property debate as the utopian sort of extreme opposites and to come up with some different conceptual ideas for those different situations we find animals in.
Yes. Thank you very much, Celeste. It seemed to me as if the concept of a duty of care, that still carries with it a lot of the baggage of torts law, but underlying it was a philosophy of responsibility. And to that extent, it was indicating the potential for a change in the nature of the model away from something which was, as I was trying to explain in the paper I was giving earlier, that was reactive towards something that was more proactive in terms of making those with ownership and control of animals actually recognise that what they have is a responsibility to those animals rather than that the animals are simply their property. Can I ask Kathleen if you had anything to comment in relation to that?
You got me a tort law. So. Well, I can only really talk with my own opinions in this, and not on a legal basis at all. So in my readings over the years, and I've always found animal welfare a fascinating read, both in terms of ethics, etc., and the law. I certainly have to say the question of whether an animal is property or is it a sentient, I think we've come to a fundamental crossroads, and it is something we do need to discuss as a society to determine where we are going to go next with our care of animals and our duty of care to animals. I really liked what you said then about the need to take a more proactive approach, and that making the ownership and control of an animal, that it is a responsibility. And I think as a premise, that's something that's very easy to agree with. What I would like to see, though, and as you just outlined, is the complexity of it. So once you start putting up one model, and I was just listening with great interest, it's, well, what does this mean and what's the impact, etc. I don't know what the answer is, but I certainly think that we do need to start having this discussion now. And I also think that we need to be inviting those people, for example, whose livelihoods do depend on animals into that discussion, so that they can understand firstly what you're trying to achieve, that they can contribute to that discussion, because it will, not just in terms of the model itself, the practicalities of it and how it might work in law, and you're absolutely right, words are so important, but how might that work actually in practice, in reality? Because theory and practice sometimes are two entirely different things.
Thank you. I think, Robert, this might be a subject that at least is not a uniquely Australian issue. Or in fact, from what you said about the live export issues in the UK, and that was not either. I wondered if there was something that you would like to contribute.
Well, you're probably going to regret inviting a political theorist rather than a lawyer to speak, in the sense that I don't think law is the most important determining factor in terms of the legal status of animals. I take a neo-Marxist view on this. Marx, for those of you who don't know, Marx argued that political and legal forms are determined by material and economic forces. Now, I don't buy that. I don't buy that totally, but I do think that the legal status of animals is a reflection of the political, cultural, and social role that animals play in our society. And until we change that, their legal status won't change. I don't think the law is not the primary determining factor here. It's society as a whole. So I think if society evolves to a position where animals aren't regarded as property, then there's nothing that the law will be able to do to prevent the legal status of animals as property from changing. But then, I'm not a lawyer.
But the law can be a driver for change. The two are not mutually exclusive. And that was part of the reason why I was referring to... Not according to Marx. Well, I may not ascribe to Marx's philosophy, but it does seem to me that law can work in tandem with other things, either to respond to changes in community values and attitudes, or to drive them.
I was being flippant to some degree. I think there are obviously, really pressing immediate problems with legal standing issues that have cropped up once or twice today, and they're obviously very important. But ultimately, the property status of animals won't change until society's views on animals change.
Okay. Can I just ask if there's anyone in the audience who has a burning question in relation to this question? It's obviously a very foundational one.
It's not a burning question, but I'm interested in Robert being another Tom. With regard to fox hunting, don't worry, I'm not going to get into that argument today, but I am interested to know what your reaction is as to whether or not it's a dichotomy between country people and town people. You were talking about CND, and I think most probably it was the only time when the Countryside Alliance came into being, which is a sort of CND thing, but it was rural instead of the other. I was just going to make my other comment, which is of no value to anyone. If you're interested, the next big thing on YouTube is the battle between the Prime Minister's cat and the Chancellor's cat, which will be appearing on YouTube. It's been a big thing in the UK. And of course, my wife, who never really understands law, says, surely there's some privacy concerns here. Weren't they asked about whether or not they were going to be filmed on the surveillance camera outside Downing Street, 10 Downing Street? But if everyone wants to see something, that's going to be the next big thing. But I'm interested, Robert, about your reaction about that and whether you think there is this dichotomy. The country country people think there's a lack of understanding with regard to town people and their most popular approach to animals, sometimes killing them by cruelty, if you know what I'm trying to say, by kindness. And I'm just interested.
Well, I won't get involved in the debate about fox hunting, because that's essentially been, it's over and done with for the time being anyway.
I was interested in the attitude, so
Yeah.
two groups.
Well, the Countryside Alliance, which was a kind of, which was an organisation which was created, at least partly by the British Field Sports Society, took on a wider remit to campaign for a whole range of rural issues, economic issues, as well as field sports. And there, I think there would have been a rural-urban divide. But the polling tends to suggest that, yes, support for fox hunting is a mainly rural phenomenon, but then there are also, you know, pretty large sections of the rural population too who are opposed to fox hunting. I mean, the opinion polls were very, very strongly in support of abolition, you know, 70, 80% on a regular basis. But, you know, the reason why it is a party political issue is that Labour is, you know, it's traditionally been seen as a working class urban party, and the Conservative Party is more a rural party. But there are, you know, there are some Conservative MPs who voted again for abolition of fox hunting too. So it's not strict party divisions, and there was also a free vote on it in the House of Commons. It wasn't as they call it a whipped issue. Party whips weren't involved. But yeah, it's different from other animal welfare issues because it does have this rural-urban divide and always has, and it's a long-running political division in the UK.
Could I ask a supplementary? It's very much an English phenomenon. It doesn't seem to have appeared anywhere else in the world, does it? This approach towards hunting and that type of thing. You don't seem to find it in Australia or in the United States or in Europe, do you?
Yeah.
Or maybe you do, maybe you know that.
The class basis of hunting is one part of it, I think. But it's only one. I think it's probably diluted over the years. But it's definitely different from other animal welfare issues, and was a soft issue for the animal welfare movement because support for abolition was so large.
Yes, well, I think we have another question here. Yes, please. I'm just wondering if there's someone who could just take the microphone. I'm sorry. Thank you very much.
Hi, Siobhan O'Sullivan, University of Melbourne. One of the things that I'm very interested in is the issue of transparency and the issue of engaging the community in the debate around animals and animal welfare and what we consider is appropriate behaviour and not appropriate behaviour. This question is primarily to Philip, but I'm also very happy to hear what other people have to say. It strikes me that transparency, or a lack thereof, has been one of the central themes of the discussions today, and we've heard it from quite a few different people's papers. And one of the other things I've noticed is that people who aren't involved in either animal agriculture or use of animals in other ways appear to have gone to great lengths to try to find out what it is they know about animal issues. And I've even detected from the audience some, I guess, mockery of speakers where they've made a slight factual error, despite the fact that they've clearly worked very hard to amass whatever information it is that they have. Now, in the area of animal research, they came up with animal ethics committees, one of the roles of which was to try and engage the community in animal welfare issues. I think that animal ethics committees are left wanting, but at least they attempt to do that. Philip, can you see any mechanism by which people who really are interested in animal issues but who are never actually going to grow pork themselves could get involved in the debate? And how can we get around this issue of we want to know and yet there seems to be some obstruction to knowing, and then when we speak we're told, oh, but you don't actually do it yourself, so, you know, what do you know?
Can I just ask you to clarify when you say, what is it particularly that you're speaking about when you say we want to know? What is it that is it the actual industry practices?
Yeah,
Precisely
yeah.
what happens on the
Does
ground?
mulesing represent my value set? Does halal slaughter meet with what I think is an appropriate or inappropriate way to treat animals? Is live export good, bad or indifferent? How can we get a range of voices, or what mechanisms could we introduce so we can engage and be informed and make decisions about what is and isn't appropriate in the way we treat animals?
Yes.
Thanks for that. That's a really hard question. Look, if I knew the answer to that, then my job would be a lot easier. What I think we have, to go back a little bit, is that in order to have transparency in information, you've got to trust the source from which it comes. And I think the animal welfare debate is not dissimilar to a whole lot of other debates where you have passionate people on all sides. I don't know how many sides there are, but they're all very passionate. And years of scar tissue with not trusting one another. And so in that circumstance, we, DAF, can publish all the information we can get. We can stick it on our website, but a lot of it will be discounted because of where it's come from. You know, we've heard today that we're apologists for industry. We've heard today that we've been captured by industry. And I was in a discussion with a live animal exporter late last week telling me that I was captive of the animal welfare lobby. So being able to provide that information very much depends on it coming from a trusted source. In these modern days, there's so much information around that you need trusted sources to be able to differentiate, to be able to sort through it all. We've tried in the last little while to put much more of our information, for example, about our whole animal welfare approach, our approach to live animals, and we've put oodles of stuff on the website. Has it made any difference? I don't know. I don't detect a better level of understanding of the complexity of the debate that I see in the sort of discussions I have. I don't know what we do when you're starting from here, to be quite honest, about how you build that sort of information in time-poor and information overloaded debates. It really is a challenge, and I don't think it's something that can be done easily overnight as well. But just I guess a general observation would be that my plea about walking together hand in hand into the sunset, government, industry and animal welfare groups, really is difficult when there is that lack of trust, there is the scar tissue of many years, and often on all sides, a legitimate reason sometimes not to disclose information. We have lots of information about the performance of individual exporters. We don't provide it because it's commercially confidential. It'd be nice to provide it because it would give you a better understanding of the performance of the live animal export system and a whole lot of other things. But we're constrained because providing that information on one company provides really important information to a competitor. So there are circumstances too that make it hard to provide it. But if I knew the answer to your question, I'd be able to try and do something about it, subject to resources. But I'd be interested in other people's views on that, because it really is what bedevils this debate, is a real lack of information.
Can I say that perhaps underlying all of this and underlying the comment that you made about the difficulties that there are in two groups in particular speaking to each other and working cooperatively, where there is a lot of scar tissue, there is a distrust between them. Do you not think that absolutely highlights the need to have an independent regulator, someone who isn't perceived as being representative of one set of interests or the other, but from which people know that they'll or have some confidence that they are getting information that is objective?
It's a really good question, and it's been posed a lot, and we certainly get a lot of criticism as being the cat that's in charge of the cream. I can see that, and I think if we could do something about that, that would take away one source of criticism of us. I'm really a bit wary of the calls for independent regulators. Goes to my opening comments today, no one's independent. So if you look at something like ASIC or you look at the ACCC, people who experience those processes, who come out the wrong side of those, for whatever reason, will always claim that that independent regulator is captured. So ACCC can, depending on which side you approach it, it's either captured by the consumer movement or it's captured by big business. It's captured by the fact that the appointment of the head of the ACCC from time to time has been criticised as being someone who's pro-industry or someone who's being pro-consumer or pro-distressed competitor. It would be good to find a way to have an independent regulator, but I'd also warn about the costs of that I think about what other things we might be able to do on animal welfare. If we had the budget that would be required to have that independent regulator, it would be neat. But at the Commonwealth level, we've had this claim a lot that there should be an independent officer of animal welfare. And I think to myself, in government terms, where would you put that? What department would you put it in? The Environment Department, the Prime Minister's Department? Everyone thinks it should be the Prime Minister's Department, but the Prime Minister will not, wouldn't have that in there. I don't think any Prime Minister would want to have that in there. It's a really difficult thing in a governance sense to come up with an independent regulator who's going to be well informed and has the information they need. I'm not arguing against it, but I think it's really hard to make it happen.
What about adopting the ombudsman model? I think the difficulty may arise in part because at the moment the animal welfare laws are largely the province of the states, although the Commonwealth has been endeavouring to take a leadership role and to try and achieve a greater degree of consistency. But one would have thought that the independent ombudsman model could be a very good place to start in terms of finding a model. And at least then you have institutional independence. Yeah. And I think one of the difficulties at the moment is you don't have that institutional independence. So there just is no hope in terms of being able to persuade people that you're independent because they are blinded in the first instance, as they must be, by the conflict of interest that just is inherent. It's an invidious position to be placed in the first instance, and I think it inevitably leads to difficulties. But sorry, did you want to comment on that, Philip?
Yeah, just one comment on that. On animal health issues, the Chief Veterinary Officer sits within the structure of the Department of Agriculture at the Commonwealth level, and I'm pretty sure it's the same in most state jurisdictions as well. That is one of those, it's a professionally, it's obviously a vet. They have to be professionally independent because they will have to make calls. So if we were to get foot and mouth in this country, it's a call to destroy a $5 billion export industry, possibly. We are able to manage that moral hazard on animal health, but we don't seem to be able to manage it on animal welfare. So it's just an interesting thing. If animal welfare gets to the point where we can't walk hand in hand into the sunset and there isn't that trust, which I actually think you're going to have no matter whether you have an independent regulator or not, then you will need, it might work, it might be worthwhile trying. We, of course, are subject to the existing ombudsman, as well. We also have in terms of competition within the farm and food processing sector, we have a grocery ombudsman. We've got a number of different sectors where we have specific ombudsmen, all of whom sit in the industry department, not the primary industry department, the Department of Industry, Technology and something or other, I forget what it's called now. But that's another model. You put it in a department that is not necessarily engaged in your business. That might work as well. But again, I'd come down to costs, and if I was thinking about what would be the next best use of a couple of $1 million a year on animal welfare, I don't think I'd put it into an independent regulator at this stage, maybe down the track.
Can I just ask, Robert, if what the position is in England? Do you have some kind of independent regulatory body?
No.
Oh. Short.
I mean, similar debates have taken place within. I mean, animal welfare policy making, as it is here, is fragmented, and it centres on different government departments. So the farm animal welfare policy is made within what is now DEFRA, the Department of the Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, used to be the Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food. And I was interested in Jed's talk about regulatory capture, because the relationship between MAF, as it was known, and the farmers was regarded as the classic case of a closed policy community, you know, with the ministry, you know, essentially acting for the in the interests of the farmers. And the DEFRA was set up as a separate government department precisely in order to try to widen out the concerns of the department, to put farming interests in with environmental interests and rural affairs in general. But within both the what is now DEFRA and within the Home Office, which deals with scientific experiments, there are advisory bodies. There's the so-called Animal Procedures Committee in the Home Office, which is an advisory body. It's appointed by, its members are appointed by the minister, but it does contain not only representatives from pharmaceutical companies and scientists, but it also contains people like me, and it has quite a wide membership. Its influence is arguably quite small, and within DEFRA there used to be, and within MAF there used to be something called the Farm Animal Welfare Council, which acted as an advisory body for that ministry, but that's been emasculated by government cutbacks. But I can't help thinking that this issue of secrecy, and I think Siobhan's right to focus on the importance of transparency, this issue of secrecy is related to this, the organisation of government departments. There's a lot of political science literature on what Jed has described as regulatory capture, but which in political science terms would be called a policy community debate. And political scientists have developed a continuum with so-called policy communities at one end of the spectrum, which are really very closed, insular government departments, which tend to do the bidding of a small number of interests, like MAF did in the past. And on the other end of the spectrum is the so-called issue network, which are much wider and contain a much wider range of interests. And it's very difficult in the animal welfare field for animal welfare groups to gain access to these insular government departments. And one of the features of them is secrecy. You know, they ideological control, again, a Marxist notion of, is very important for these insular government departments. I don't know about the Australian experience. I'm not.
One more thing.
Yeah. But the point is that getting access to information is power. I think Graham said that at the end of his talk, and he's absolutely right. And in fact, the case that Graham was referring to in the UK involved a group, anti-vivisection group called Uncaged, who got access to this huge amount of material, which essentially showed that the government wasn't enforcing the 1986 Act effectively, and that had an enormous impact on public opinion. But the state had a vested interest in keeping that information secret.
Thanks, Robert.
Can I
It's all right, Philip, I'm going to let you speak.
Oh, good.
I was just going to say I'm very mindful of the time. So I think, Philip, you had something that you wanted to add quickly, and Kathleen, you had something to add. And then sadly, I think questions might have to be asked in the reception that's following, where there is going to be, I gather, free food and drinks, and also a talk by the Honourable Justice Michael Slattery as well. So, Philip, if I can just ask you then, just to be brief, and Kathleen also.
Thanks, Melissa. I'll tell you one thing that economists know: there's no such thing as free food and drinks. But look, just the point that Robert's made on MAF's a really good one. I worked in the UK for 18 months in the late 90s and witnessed the complete destruction of a department that had just celebrated its 100th birthday. You had this nice building in Old Scotland Yard, and they completely lost the trust of the entire community over BSE because of the issue that's been talked about, where the cat's in charge of the cream. There were scientists in MAF who were sort of, in some ways, holding back information from the public that would have been quite important during the time. And just to clarify, I think if there was the prospect of an independent office that would be well funded, that would be sustainable, then I, for one, would be great to have that responsibility lifted from the shoulders of the department. I really was just trying to make the point that practically and pragmatically, I just can't see it happening.
Thank Thank you, Kathleen.
Well, I just want to build on what Phil said, and I seem to be agreeing a lot with him, so I just want to dispel something here. I don't always agree, but I think he did make a very important point. The erosion of trust historically between NGOs and livestock industries, etc. It does leave scar tissue. And before you even get to an independent regulatory body, if that were the case, we now need to start taking those steps to building trust. That's the most important thing. I didn't mind the idea of an ombudsman, but I'm a bit confused as to, well, that's a Commonwealth position. What are you going to do at the states? And then I was thinking, well, that's a very fragmented, I could see that becoming very fragmented as well, which is what we want to avoid. But what we do need to do is start building trust.
Thank you very much. That seems a strong note to finish on. I think Peter Redden is going to speak to close the session. Conference.
Thank you, Melissa. This is a rather difficult situation for me because, unlike the other speakers at this conference today, I was given about 24 hours notice that I had to sort of wrap up. And it's always a very difficult thing to do, to wrap up, especially when you're as inexpert as I am in animal law or animal rights issues. So I'm not going to try to wrap up the conference in that sense, in that traditional way. What I will try to do is direct my comments to what brought me to this conference and what I got out of it. And in a sense, what brought me to this conference was that I have for a long time had an interest in animals, but it's only been in the last few years that I have begun to acquire any, if you like, expertise or detailed knowledge about animals. My interest in animals really is part of my interest in food. And that interest stems from a childhood, in fact, where I grew up on the peripheries of Sydney on a 5-acre farm in the 1950s and 1960s. My parents had a farm in which they grew produce for sale, in particular tomatoes. But we had this 5-acre farm that also produced a lot of the food that we ate. Obviously, we had tomatoes for breakfast, lunch and dinner, and various other vegetables that my mother raised in a very significant vegetable patch. But we also had a cow and a lot of chickens that provided meat, milk and eggs, which were obviously staples to a fairly simple, what might call a peasant diet, given that my parents were peasants and came from a peasant community in the Balkans. The approach of my parents to animals, I now know, was undoubtedly influenced by their reading in the Dalmatian hinterland at the age of 7 of René Descartes. Clearly, their views were influenced, and they clearly fell into the Descartes view of animals. So we ate meat, and coming from a Balkan culture, we ate a lot of meat. And it's through that sort of food that we ate that my interest, I suppose, and given that we ate a lot of animals, my interest in animals morphs into an interest in food. And it was interesting today that a lot of the papers, overwhelmingly this conference today, dealt with animals as food. There wasn't a lot of discussion about animals as pets or animals in scientific research. It was all pretty much focused on food. And if you'll pardon the pun, the conference today gave me a lot of food for thought. When I started to discuss and think about animals, I started to read some of the theoretical literature on that, and that was where I first became exposed to the writings of Robert Garner. And I was very interested in his presentation today. Instinctively, as an academic, I found in the readings that I'm sort of inclined intellectually to being an abolitionist. However, I've got issues because I'm also a meat eater. So I've got some things to work out. As I said, my interest is spurred in animals with respect to food, and as I said, I got a lot of things today. I mean, my father and mother grew tomatoes for a living, and I can tell you I haven't eaten a decent tomato in 4 decades. And in many respects, I can probably say I haven't had as good a steak or a roast as I used to have when I was a teenager, when my mother prepared them. And I get a lot of information today that sort of confirmed my beliefs as to why that has happened, in the way that the beef and meat and poultry and whatever that we eat is produced today. Indeed, the only decent food that I really, really enjoy is when I go back to the Balkans, into the mountains, into the villages, and I eat the food that I ate in the 50s and 60s. And a lot of that has to do with the way we've treated and produced animals for food. And there's a lot of discussion from, as I said today, from that perspective. And I found it very interesting and informative. And as I said, I've got a lot of thinking to do to try to work out how I can be both a liberationist, an abolitionist, I should say, and also a meat eater. Maybe I won't be. Today's conference was the culmination of a lot of work by a lot of people. I think, in finally wrapping up the conference, to acknowledge the work of the Centre for Legal Governance at Macquarie Law School and the RSPCA in organising this conference, and also to acknowledge the contribution that's been made by the Australian Academy of Law in hosting the cocktail that we're actually going to go out to in a few moments' time. But in particular, it's all good and well to say these organisations have done a lot of work, and we have to acknowledge and accept that. But there are some people who actually have to do the hard work, the grunt work. And I think we do need at this point, and this will be my final comment, well, final comment by one, to acknowledge and thank the efforts of Professors Denise Myerson and Brian Peskin at the Centre of Legal Governance for their leadership in organising this conference, ably assisted, and perhaps really the people that we have to thank that did the really, really hard work. Shideh Modabar, please stand up, Shideh, and Jed Goodfellow. They did all the really hard work in putting this program together and organising it so that it ran as efficiently and as smoothly as it has done. So again, I think it's our thanks to Denise, Brian, Shideh and Jed for that work. Finally, I'd like to thank, on behalf of the organisers of this conference, all the speakers that have come to, I think, inform and illuminate us today, and in particular to thank Robert for flying in from a busy career and life as a head of department at his university in Leicester, and he has to go back tomorrow, so it's a long way to come, and we really do appreciate making the effort, but we also appreciate the efforts that have, the contributions from the other speakers. And as part of Macquarie University, I'd also like to thank all of you. Many of you have come from interstate, as I've seen, and it's been a really great conference because this is the sort of first conference that I've been to where there has been such a diversity and significant representation from the academics, from the practitioners, if you like, and from the industry itself. And there's a lot of conversations that have started today, and I think it's about time that we moved on and continue those conversations to the reception outside. Thank you very much.